So I wanted to create a short video based on a question that was asked in class about essentially what the ion flow looks like in a reentry pathway, or how an electrical impulse is self-perpetuating. And when we think about electricity, typically we're looking at the flow of ions, and what's unique about the heart or our cells is, unlike a simple wire, they have ion channels that allow for the influx and efflux of ions in order to support depolarization. So I'm going to draw in some sodium channels here and some calcium channels, because sodium channels and calcium channels are the basic function for myocardial and pacemaker depolarization. Or if I'm going to activate a myocardial cell or a pacemaker cell, what I'm doing is I'm allowing for the influx of sodium and calcium into that cell. So I'm going to just work on the basic premise again of we can look at either our pacemaker action potential or our cardiac action potential. So again, if we're looking at pacemaker potential, it kind of looks like this. If we're looking at cardiac action potential, we know it looks like this. In both cases, sodium and potassium play a critical role in depolarization. So in the cardiac action potential, in phase 0 here, we're looking at sodium influx into the cell. And the same thing is happening in order to meet threshold in our pacemaker potential. We have the IF funny channels open in order to allow sodium influx. So that's what we're seeing in both of these kind of areas, is sodium is moving into our cells, in this case the pacemaker, in this case the myocardial cell, that's allowing for depolarization. So we're seeing this positive spike, or we're seeing this spike in electrical activity leading to depolarization. In the next phase of your pacemaker potential, calcium plays a critical role. So the influx of calcium is occurring in order to hit that peak potential. And in your myocardial action potential, the influx of calcium is what actually gives you your plateau. So in both cases, sodium and calcium are the major ions that are leading to depolarization, or we're seeing influx of those positive ions into the cell. And it's that influx that allows for depolarization or activation of the cell. And that's what's moving electrical current ahead in something like a reentry pathway. So what I want you to imagine here is, we've had a PAC, or we've had the unidirectional block that starts a reentry pathway. So electrical impulse has moved through our conduction system. And we know that activation occurs due to the influx of calcium and sodium. So sodium and calcium are playing a role. So as sodium and calcium enter a cell, so we know that, so we're going to have sodium influx. So we have sodium ions, which are positively charged, entering the cell. We have calcium ions that are positively charged, entering the cell. And the overall internal charge of the cell becomes more positive. That's depolarization. What happens is, in our conduction system in our heart cells, is we have gap junctions that allow for these ions to then move to cells in front of it, or they move ahead in the cell, or we have those ions moving forward into other cells. And as this cell becomes more positive, it too opens its voltage-gated sodium and calcium channels. So as these ions move into this cell and create a more positive environment, the next cell over will also lead to sodium influx and calcium influx. So calcium and sodium are moving in, and this is a self-perpetuating cycle. So this sodium potassium can keep flowing into the next cell, depolarizing that cell, causing more opening, and we see this as a constant cycle moving along our conduction system. So that's how an impulse can perpetuate. Now, when we look at the normal heart, the reason why we don't see a self-perpetuating rhythm, or we don't see the electrical system continuing throughout the heart, is because there's a termination. In our normal conduction system, again, we have our SA node, AV node, bundle of His, bundle branches, and Purkinje fibers. So when an impulse starts at the AV node, And it follows this exact process. So we start to see sodium and calcium influx, which will perpetuate an impulse down to the AV node, which will then perpetuate an impulse down to the bundle of His, and then through each of our bundle branches, it terminates at the Purkinje fibers. Essentially, we hit the end of the line where there's no more cells available to stimulate, and the impulse won't flow backwards. So it flows out towards the ends, stimulates the tissue, and then that's basically it, that we see the rest period or diastole after the heart beats. Now, what's unique about a reentry pathway is instead of having a linear track that has an end, we have a cyclic process that has developed. So in the case of something like an AV nodal RNT, or AV node reentry tachycardia, what we see happening is a reentry phenomena occurs within the AV node. So let's take a look at what we're talking about here. So if we draw our AV node like this, or take a look closer at our AV node. Oops, I prefer that to be square. So let's take a look at our AV node. What happens is we have an accessory pathway that forms that is going to allow for an impulse to become cyclic. So when we have critical timing, the formation of accessory pathway, and then either a unidirectional block or a premature complex, and if this is our AV node, instead of having a linear movement, or instead of having linear movement of ions and electrons, or ions and electricity, moving downwards, we create a reentry pathway that, again, instead of having what appears to be a linear track, creates more of a roundabout, or provides the opportunity for an impulse to be able to wrap around itself. So it's the presence of that accessory pathway that turns a linear track into essentially a fork in the road, or a roundabout, or a circle. And what you can see here is that if I have a circle, that impulse can be self-perpetuating. So what happens is we have influx of ions. So say our impulse is traveling through here. So the impulse has started to circle around or self-perpetuate. We know that in order to do that, what we start to see is the influx of sodium and calcium. So sodium and calcium are flowing into this cell and making it more positive. So the cell becomes depolarized. We know those ions can then leak to the next cell, depolarizing it. It becomes more positive, and this will continue around and around this cycle. So the only thing that's required for this to happen in perpetuity, or to allow this to just keep cycling around and around, is that by the time this impulse gets back to the start, our ion pumps will have had to move our sodium back out and our calcium back out, and these channels will have to be ready for depolarization again. So once this impulse comes back up around after its first time around the loop, if we got sodium back outside and calcium back outside, it can again open these voltage-gated channels, and sodium and calcium can rush back into the cell, and it just happens over and over again. So the reentry pathway has to be just long enough that the cell has time to shift its ions back out. Because remember, sodium should live outside, calcium should live outside. The only reason it gets in is because an impulse has opened voltage-gated channels that allows it in. So our sodium-calcium pumps and our sodium-potassium pump will actually pump these ions out after the impulse leaves. So that's what we see happening in our refractory period and repolarization. And if this impulse comes around and gets back to this tissue, by the time we've had repolarization of this tissue, or the pumps have pushed sodium and calcium back out to where they should be, we can reactivate this pathway again, and it can happen all over again. So one of the reasons why a reentry phenomena can be self-limiting, or you might see someone go into an SVT and then they go out of it on their own, is if this impulse goes around the entire pathway, and when it gets back to the start or back to the initial cell and is trying to loop around again, if this cell hasn't had enough time to push those ions back to where they belong. So our sodium and calcium should go back outside the cell. If that hasn't happened, this cell will still be in refractory and we won't be able to stimulate it. So that's a piece of that critical timing. So I hope that makes sense to explain what's happening from an ion perspective in a reentry phenomenon.